You're in my seat." The words cut to the hush of boarding like a blade, sharp and loud enough for every head in first class to snap toward row 2. A woman stood in the aisle, chin tilted high, her hand gripping the headrest of seat 2B. She wasn't whispering. She wasn't embarrassed. She wanted the whole cabin to hear her accusation. In the leather seat beneath her glare sat a man dressed in a tailored blue suit. The fabric was sharp, crisp, untouched by wrinkles, the kind of suit that whispered quiet power. He looked up calmly, his expression unreadable, though the weight of eyes pressing on him was undeniable. His name was David Miller, CEO of a company most of the cabin had never heard of but soon would. The woman leaned closer, her voice dripping with disbelief. "There's no way this is your seat." It wasn't a question. It was a declaration, a judgment packaged in confidence. A ripple of murmurs passed through the rows. Some passengers glanced at their phones, pretending not to listen, while others stared openly. The air grew tight, heavy with unspoken thoughts. A black man in first class. Was that the real offense here? David didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. He simply sat with his boarding pass resting on the tray table, plain proof of his place in 2B. But silence in that moment felt dangerous. Silence in the wrong hands could be mistaken for guilt. The woman's tone rose, just loud enough to push the tension another notch. "I'm going to call the crew if you don't move. Right now." Her escalation hit like the second strike of a drumbeat, accusation, then threat. The cabin shifted with unease, as if everyone sensed this was no longer a small misunderstanding. But here's the twist. She wasn't even holding a first-class ticket. She had an economy seat printed on the flimsy slip, clutched in her manicured hand. She hadn't checked. Or maybe she had. And this was never about the ticket at all. This was about who she thought belonged and who she thought didn't. So let me ask you, if it were you sitting in that seat, dressed sharp, ticket in hand, and someone stood over you declaring you didn't belong, what would you do? Would you speak up, or would you let the judgment hang in the air like poison? The flight attendant arrived, heels clicking against a narrow aisle, the polished smile already fading as she read the tension in the cabin. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her eyes moving first to the woman, not the man seated quietly. The decision of who to believe seemed to be made before a single word of evidence passed between them. David raised the boarding pass with steady hands, but the moment was already rigged. Around him, strangers watched with that mix of fascination and discomfort, the kind that keeps people glued to a scene but too afraid to intervene. The luxury of first class, the wide leather chairs, the chilled glasses of sparkling water, had suddenly turned into a stage. And he, the man in seat 2B, was cast as the intruder. The woman crossed her arms, smirking like victory was already hers. Passengers leaned in, some angling their phones discreetly, recording snippets of humiliation dressed as protocol. David stayed still, his face unreadable, but the air around him pulsed with something deeper. He had faced stares like these before, boardrooms, lounges, clubs where he was first doubted before being heard. And yet, here it was again, played out in front of strangers thousands of feet from takeoff. The flight attendant gave a polite nod toward the woman. "Ma'am, let me take a look at your ticket." But her tone already leaned towards siding with her, already leaning away from the man in the suit. Every second stretched longer, thicker, as if time itself was testing him. First-class cabins are built for silence, for discretion, for luxury that doesn't sweat or shout. But now, silence had turned hostile, and discretion had become a weapon. David adjusted his tie, slow and deliberate. His calmness wasn't surrender. It was something else, something the cabin had yet to understand. The attendant glanced at his boarding pass, but didn't announce the truth, didn't clear his name. She simply pursed her lips and said, "Sir, please remain seated while we sort this out." The words sounded neutral on the surface, but the undertone was clear. He was under suspicion. And just like that, the weight of judgment thickened, not from proof, not from facts, but from the quiet suggestion that he didn't belong. All around, people leaned in, phones angled discreetly, whispers trading like currency. Everyone wanted to know how far this would go. But what happened next silenced the entire first-class cabin. The cabin went silent as David slowly lifted his boarding pass. His hand was steady, deliberate, as if every movement carried the weight of years of experience in hostile rooms. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply held out the slip of paper, the undeniable proof that Tubi belonged to him. The flight attendant leaned forward, her polished nails brushing the paper for less than a second. She glanced, barely reading, then looked back at David with a thin smile. A smile that wasn't about courtesy. It was about dismissal. "Sir," she said softly, almost rehearsed, "I'm going to ask you to cooperate." Cooperate. A word that sounded harmless, but dripped with accusation. She hadn't even compared the ticket numbers. She didn't want to. Jennifer crossed her arms, her smirk widening. She didn't need proof. The crew had already decided who belonged in this cabin and who didn't. The sight of a black man in that seat clashed with their unspoken expectations, and the rules bent instantly to fit prejudice. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. They had seen the boarding pass too, plain as day. They knew what the paper said. But silence was safer. Silence, after all, was a currency of discretion in first class. David tilted his head slightly. "You didn't read it," he said, calm but firm. The attendant's smile thinned into irritation. "Sir, we understand, but let's not cause a scene." A scene. That's what they called it when a black man insisted on being treated fairly. Not proof, not correction. A scene. Jennifer let out a mocking laugh, as if the verdict had been delivered. "Told you," she said, her voice dripping with false triumph. "He doesn't belong here." The words hung heavy, wrapping around the cabin like invisible chains. Every eye on David now carried the same unspoken question. Why is he pushing this? Why doesn't he just move? David remained still, his suit still flawless, his posture unbroken. But inside, humiliation pressed down like a storm. Not the kind that makes you explode, but the kind that forces you to swallow anger, to sit in it, to let others believe they've won, while something far larger brews beneath the surface. Have you ever been in that position? Ticket in hand, proof on the table, but still dismissed like your presence itself was an inconvenience? What would you have done? Would you raise your voice? Or would you let silence stretch, knowing the system was built to twist even your defense into defiance? The attendant didn't wait for an answer. She simply stepped back, her verdict clear without words. The paper in David's hand meant nothing here. Jennifer's smirk deepened. Her seat, her lie, had just been validated by the authority of a uniform. She leaned back slightly, already savoring victory. And that's when a passenger across the aisle shifted, their phone angled ever so slightly, the red recording light glowing faintly. They had captured the entire exchange, the proof that proof itself had been ignored. But what they did with that recording would change everything. The murmurs in first class hadn't settled when another figure appeared. A senior flight attendant, blazer pressed and posture sharpened by years of operation necessity, stepped into the aisle. Her presence was meant to project order, but in this cabin, order meant something else. Reinforcement. She didn't start with David. She started with the woman who barged in from economy, the one still standing like a conqueror in the aisle. "Ma'am, what seems to be the issue?" Her tone was warm, sympathetic. The woman didn't hesitate. "He's in my seat. I paid for 2B. The senior attendant turned, her eyes landing on David with practiced neutrality, that kind of polished face airlines train into their staff, the kind that hides a bias behind discretion. David raised his boarding pass again. His proof. His truth. But truth here was already labeled random, already stripped of authority. The attendant barely glanced at the slip of paper. "Sir, we've had complaints," she said evenly, "and to avoid disruption, we'll need you to move." Think about that for a moment. A man shows evidence, and the evidence vanishes under the weight of someone else's entitlement. That's not procedure. That's experience weaponized. A system rehearsed to always tilt one way. David sat still, his eyes calm but unyielding. "This is my seat," he said, each word steady, careful, as if he knew even tone could be turned against him. The attendant's smile hardened. "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll have to involve ground security." Ground security. That word dropped into the cabin like ice water. Passengers shifted in their seats. They knew what it meant, Escalation, handcuffs, headlines. For many, the sight of security boarding a plane was routine protocol. But for a black man, it was danger. Even the threat carried humiliation. The woman standing beside him smirked, victory glowing in her eyes. She didn't need to win fairly. She just needed authority to echo her lie. Have you ever felt that sting? When proof doesn't matter, when the system bends itself around your skin before it even hears your voice. A man across the aisle adjusted his phone, screen angled downward. His thumb tapped, recording still rolling. His silence spoke louder than words. People need to see this. The senior attendant leaned closer, lowering her voice, though everyone could still hear. Sir, don't make this harder than it has to be. Cooperate, and we can resolve this quickly. Resolve, a word dressed up to sound like fairness, but dripping with compromise. Resolve here didn't mean justice. It meant submission. David adjusted his tie, the red soda stain from earlier still fresh across his blue suit. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. His silence wasn't weakness. It was calculation. The attendant straightened, tapping her tablet. Final notice, she said sharply, her professional mask thinning. Either you move, or security will remove you before takeoff. Every passenger now leaned forward, breaths caught. Some were horrified, others entertained. The cabin had turned into a stage, and everyone knew they were watching a man stand at the edge of humiliation, or something far bigger. And then, without a word, David reached slowly into his carry-on bag. The announcement wasn't loud, but it hit like a hammer. The senior flight attendant leaned in, her polished badge glinting under the cabin lights. Sir, this is your final warning. If you don't move, security will remove you from this aircraft. The words weren't about procedure. They were about humiliation, the kind that strips away dignity in front of strangers and calls it operational necessity. David didn't flinch. He stayed seated, his blue suit still immaculate despite the sticky red soda stain across the chest. To anyone else, he looked like a man defeated, but his silence wasn't surrender. It was something else, a calculation nobody in that cabin could read. Across the aisle, passengers exchanged uneasy looks. Some avoided his eyes, sinking deeper into their seats. Others leaned forward, phones gripped tighter, wondering if they were about to watch a man dragged out of first class for crime of not looking the part. And then there was Jennifer. She leaned back with the confidence of someone who had already won. Her smirk said everything. You see? The system was built for me, not for you. Think about that for a second. A lie in one mouth, a uniform backing it, and suddenly a black man's proof, his boarding pass, his presence, became invisible. This wasn't random. This was experience weaponized. The attendant took a step back, signaling to the other crew. The aisle felt narrower, the air heavier. Everyone knew what was next. Security boarding the plane. And with that came headlines, mugshots, reputations destroyed in minutes. Have you ever been in that position? When the truth was in your hand, but the room had already decided you were guilty? Would you have stood your ground? Or would you have moved just to make the storm pass? David stayed still. His breathing was calm, almost too calm for the moment. Silence pressed against the walls of the cabin. Every second stretched like an eternity. Jennifer sighed dramatically, shaking her head as if she were the victim of an inconvenience. Some people just don't know their place, she muttered loudly enough for Rose around her to hear. And that was it. That sentence sealed the humiliation. The whispers spread, the judgment thickened. David sat there, a man surrounded by wealth and privilege, treated as if he were trespassing in a seat he had paid for. The attendant's voice broke the silence again, sharper this time. Sir, this is your last chance. Cooperate, or we'll be forced to remove you. The phrase forced to remove wasn't just a threat. It was a ritual, a performance of power designed to make everyone else in first class comfortable with the outcome. The message was clear. Order matters more than justice. David adjusted his cufflinks, his face unreadable. But deep down, the humiliation was complete. They had pushed him to the point of no return. And then, with the entire cabin watching, he slowly reached down toward his carry-on bag. His hand slipped inside, deliberate and steady. The crew tensed. Jennifer leaned forward, her smirk faltering for the first time. What he pulled out next was silence the entire cabin. The cabin was still buzzing with tension, a thick air of humiliation hanging over David like smoke that wouldn't clear. He sat there, shoulders straight, blue suit stained with soda, the eyes of first class fixed on him as if waiting for him to break. The flight attendants had moved on, smug in their authority, convinced the matter was settled. Jennifer leaned back with the kind of satisfaction only arrogance provides, sipping her replacement drink as if she had won something far larger than a seat. But David's silence was not surrender. It was calculation. Behind the calm in his eyes, behind the measured breaths he drew in and out, there was something else. Something the cabin could not see, and Jennifer could never imagine. Slowly, without rushing, he reached under the seat in front of him. His fingers brushed the zipper of his carry-on, and the soft rasp of it opening cut through the muffled hum of the aircraft. For the first time since the confrontation began, David moved with intent. He didn't look at Jennifer. He didn't glance at the crew. He just unzipped, reached inside, and pulled out a small, sleek, black device. It was no ordinary phone. No airline passenger had seen anything like it. Matte black, slim, with a subtle metallic edge that caught the cabin light. It looked like it belonged in a war room, not row 2B of a commercial flight. A satellite-linked device, designed for places where no signal should exist. The passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, trying not to stare, but unable to look away. Jennifer's smirk flickered for a moment. She squinted at the strange device in his hand, suspicion breaking through her arrogance. To her, it wasn't just a phone. It was a question mark she couldn't answer. David pressed a single button. The screen lit up with cold precision. He lifted it to his ear. No emotion, no hesitation. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, and chillingly certain. "It's done," he said. "Execute contingency. Full acquisition. Now." That was all. 5 words. Nothing more. He didn't explain, didn't justify, didn't raise his voice. He simply ended the call and slipped the device back into the carry-on, zipping it closed with the same calm he had unzipped it. To the untrained ear, it might have sounded like nonsense. But to anyone with power, with access, with something to lose, it was a language of command. The kind of language that turned humiliation into empire. Jennifer blinked, unsettled. For the first time that day, she couldn't read the man in front of her. The flight attendants whispered near the galley, oblivious of the chain reaction that had just been set in motion. Around the cabin, a few passengers exchanged glances, as if they had just witnessed something more than a man making a call. The quiet moment passed, but it left a residue. Something invisible had shifted. The man they thought they had cornered had just opened a door no one else could see. And then, one seat across, a faint glow. A passenger's phone screen lit up with a notification. A live video had just gone viral. Tens of thousands were already watching. And that was when everything began to unravel. The cabin was heavy with silence, the kind that makes every breath sound louder than it should. David sat in 2B, his blue suit stained red, his dignity bruised, but his posture still steady. The crew thought the confrontation was over. Jennifer thought she had won, but the story wasn't finished, not even close. Across the aisle, a passenger gripped their phone tighter. They had been recording from the very first accusation, and now their thumb hovered over the screen. One tap, and the clip was live on Twitter. The caption burned with clarity. Airline crew trying to kick a black man out his paid seat. Within minutes, the cabin began to hum with something different. Not voices, but vibrations. Screens lit up in pockets and purses. Notifications stacked faster than passengers could swipe them away. A few leaned over their phones, faces pale and aglow. Imagine sitting on that plane, watching the story you're living explode online in real time. The confrontation wasn't confined to row 2B anymore. It was being dissected by thousands, then tens of thousands of strangers. Every glance, every smirk, every dismissive gesture was now evidence in a courtroom of public opinion. And the comments were brutal. Pure racism. No excuse. He showed the ticket. Why won't they look at it? This airline is done. Some passengers shifted in their seats, suddenly aware that silence made them complicit. A woman in the third row buried her face in her hands. A man in the aisle seat pretended to nap. though his jaw was clenched tight. Nobody wanted to admit what they had just witnessed with their own eyes. Jennifer, oblivious at first, kept her smug smile. But it didn't last. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down, and the color drained from her face. The clip was everywhere. Strangers were tagging the airline, demanding answers. Comment after comment called her out by description, the woman in first class spilling soda on him. She wasn't a private passenger anymore. She was a symbol of everything the internet loved to hate. The crew noticed too. Their tablets pinged with alerts, but they tried to keep their faces blank. Still, the anxiety showed in the way they whispered in the galley, the way they avoided David's eyes. They had no idea that while they pushed him down in the cabin, the world outside was lifting him up. And then it happened. One passenger's device dinged with a breaking news alert. The headline glared across the screen. Viral video of black man harassed in first class sparks outrage. The image? David, sitting tall in his seat, boarding pass still in his hand. Think about the irony. 30,000 feet in the air, and yet the story was already crashing down on the airline below. What began as one woman's entitlement had turned into a global spectacle, in less time than it takes to reach cruising altitude. Have you ever seen injustice so raw that it forces you to act, even if all you can do is hold up a phone? Would you have recorded, or would you have stayed quiet, telling yourself it wasn't your business? The flight attendants tried to maintain their routines, pouring drinks, adjusting trays, but the air had changed. Everyone knew something bigger was happening. The humiliation in row 2B was no longer private. It was public. It was permanent. And far away, in a quiet office, someone else's screen lit up. A junior airline manager stared at the viral clip in horror. His eyes widened. His heart pounded. He recognized the man in the video. This wasn't just another passenger. This was the CEO of Apex Innovations. And the airline had just humiliated the man whose signature could decide their survival. Far above the clouds, Sky Continental Flight 209 droned west toward San Francisco. Inside, first class buzzed with uneasy silence, passengers pretending to read or sip champagne while secretly refreshing their phones. The viral video of the confrontation in row 2B was already spreading like wildfire. What felt like a small humiliation in one corner of the cabin was now a global story. But the real storm was not inside the plane. It was on the ground. In a glass office far below, a junior manager at Sky Continental headquarters glanced at his dashboard. His job was simple: monitor mentions of the airline, flag crises early, and feed them to higher-ups. Usually it was about late baggage, delayed flights, or angry customers tweeting from a gate. But tonight, a notification flashed red on his screen. Viral video. Black man harassed in Sky Continental first class. He clicked. The screen filled with shaky footage from the plane. There it was. The smirk of the passenger who had spilled her soda, the dismissive glance of the crew, and the calm, dignified face of the man in the blue suit refusing to move. At first, the manager thought this was just another messy PR fire. Bad optics, yes, but manageable, until his eyes locked on the man in the video, and his blood ran cold, because he recognized him. That wasn't just another passenger. That wasn't just a random businessman in a tailored suit. That was David Miller, CEO of Apex Innovations. The same David Miller who was scheduled to meet Sky Continental's executives within days to finalize a deal worth billions. A deal their airline desperately needed to survive in a brutal market. The manager froze, palms sweating. He replayed the clip, hoping he was mistaken. But no, it was him. The same face he'd seen in corporate briefing slides. The same name whispered with both awe and fear in strategy meetings. Do you see the irony here? In that cabin, they treated him like an imposter. Just another black man who didn't belong. But in the corporate world, he wasn't just a customer. He was leverage. He was power. He was the one man who could pull the rug out from under their entire empire. The manager leaned back in his chair, heart racing. He knew exactly what this meant. This wasn't just a PR crisis anymore. This was existential. The humiliation in first class had just placed the airline itself on the edge of destruction. And yet, up in row 2B, David hadn't said a word. He hadn't revealed who he was. He hadn't defended himself with his title or his wealth. He had let the humiliation play out, let the soda stain dry on his suit, let the video spread unchecked. While the crew dismissed him as insignificant, the truth was slowly detonating across the corporate chain of command. Have you ever seen power hide in plain sight? The kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself. Because the moment it's revealed, everything changes? That's what was sitting quietly in seat 2B. The junior manager stared at the screen, terrified. He knew he had to escalate this immediately. But even as his hand hovered over the phone to call his superior, one thought gnawed at him. What if it's already too late? Because somewhere above the clouds, the man they had humiliated wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was a predator circling his prey. And at Sky Continental headquarters, the scramble to contain the disaster was about to begin. Phones buzzed like angry bees inside Sky Continental's glass headquarters. The viral video of a black man being humiliated in first class was no longer just a trending hashtag. It was a corporate earthquake. In a corner office, executives leaned over glowing conference tables, voices sharp and panicked. Words like discretion, experience, operational necessity, and random were thrown around, as if jargon could disguise the truth. Their airline was collapsing in real time. The junior manager who had first recognized David Miller's face had already escalated the crisis. Now, the CEO's name echoed through every boardroom screen. This wasn't just bad press. This was personal. Because the man their crew had treated like an intruder was the very same man holding the pen on a deal that could decide their future. Imagine the scene. One executive clutching his tie, whispering, "This is catastrophic." Another pacing the room, muttering, "How do we spin this as an operational necessity gone wrong?" They weren't talking about fairness. They weren't talking about racism. They were talking about survival. And outside those walls, the storm only grew. Major news outlets had already picked up the story. Screens across the country showed David, calm in his seat, the soda stain spreading across his blue suit, while crew members looked the other way. Commentators called it the perfect symbol of elite racism. A black man dressed for success, reduced to an imposter by nothing more than prejudice. Inside the crisis call, voices clashed. We'll issue a statement. We'll frame it as a misunderstanding. Too late. Another snapped. This isn't just any passenger. That's Miller. He could end us. They tried everything. PR drafts full of hollow phrases, legal memos weighing liability, strategy teams pulling up past incidents to see if this fit a random pattern. But they knew it wasn't random. It was systemic, and for the first time, they were cornered. Have you ever seen people scramble not because they were sorry, but because they were scared? That was Sky Continental in that moment. Fear, not conscience, drove every decision. Meanwhile, investors were calling. Shares were already wobbling as the video climbed past 1 million views. A single question echoed through Wall Street calls. If this is how they treat their best clients, how safe is this brand? And still, the executives refused to say the word out loud. Racism. Instead, they hid behind soft phrases. Guest experience, unexpected outcome, isolated event. But everyone in that room knew the truth. The humiliation of one black man in seat 2B now threatened to humiliate their entire airline before the world. Picture the irony. For years, Sky Continental had sold itself as the airline of elites, a sanctuary in the sky where the powerful could relax. Yet tonight, the very image of their luxury brand was being rewritten, from sanctuary to stage for racial humiliation. And worse, the man they had tried to strip of dignity was the one man who could strip them of everything. One voice finally broke through the noise. A senior executive leaned forward, his face pale. "You don't understand. He doesn't need to sue us. He doesn't need to protest. He already owns the power to bury us." The room froze, because in their scramble, they had forgotten who David Miller really was. Not just a passenger, not just a victim, but a CEO with the capital and connections to pull the rug from under their empire. And while they panicked, David sat quietly in row 2B, his phone dark, his face unreadable, the plan already in motion. The executives knew the clock was ticking. The only question was, Would they survive long enough to stop him? The cabin hummed with low murmurs, a nervous energy that no one dared voice too loudly. David sat perfectly still in seat 2B, his ruined suit drying stiff against his skin. On the surface, he looked like a man beaten by humiliation, a passenger forced into silence by uniforms and arrogance. But inside, the air was shifting. What the flight attendants and Jennifer thought was the end of his dignity was, in truth, the beginning of their undoing. David reached again into his carry-on, his movements measured, unhurried. His hand brushed against the cold, matte surface of the satellite phone, a device few passengers would even recognize, much less carry. He lifted it to his ear, his voice low and steady, almost a whisper drowned by the engines. "Proceed with full acquisition," he said. "No delays. Every detail locked. Begin immediately." To the strangers around him, it might have looked like an ordinary call, but for those on the other end, it was the signal they had been waiting for. A deal months in preparation, worth billions, was no longer pending. It was activated, signed not with ink, but with humiliation. The irony was sharp enough to taste. Minutes earlier, a flight attendant had told him he didn't belong in this seat. Now, with a few quiet words, David was placing himself in a position to own the very airline that tried to erase him. The balance of power had shifted so drastically, so invisibly, that not a single person in the cabin realized history had just pivoted in row 2B. Jennifer leaned back across the aisle, sipping smugly on another soda, still glancing his way like she had won something permanent. She had no idea her actions had triggered a chain reaction stretching far beyond this aircraft. The uniformed crew, their authority thick with arrogance, stood at the front of the cabin pretending they had restored order. They didn't know their own employer was now dangling over a cliff, and David had already cut the rope. But David wasn't gloating. There was no smirk, no outward triumph. Just silence, a silence that carried the weight of discipline, and fury held in check. To lash out here would reduce him to their expectations. To remain calm was to remind himself who he was, a man whose influence traveled farther than any plane in the sky. The passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. They couldn't hear his words, but they sensed attention. One woman whispered, "Why does he look so calm after all that?" Another man shook his head, uneasy. They were picking up on something they couldn't name. Power, when silent, unsettles a room. And yet, the real drama wasn't just in that cabin. Across the country, offices were already stirring with movement. Lawyers were picking up secure calls. Advisors were confirming wire transfers. Corporate insiders were rushing into boardrooms, faces pale with disbelief. The acquisition had begun, and no one inside Sky Continental had been warned. Imagine this. A man publicly humiliated in front of strangers, treated as though he had no right to dignity. And in the same breath, that man quietly set into motion a deal that could erase careers, topple executives, and expose the entire system that dismissed him. That is the kind of power society never expect a black man to hold, until it's too late. David rested the phone on his lap, his thumb hovering, then pressing firmly to end the call. No one clapped. No one gasped. The entire plane carried on as if nothing had happened. But a silent countdown had begun, ticking beneath the surface. Every second brought the airline closer to its reckoning. And then one of the flight attendants walked back toward him, her expression sharp, her voice clipped with authority. "Sir," she said coldly, "we need you to cooperate, or this will escalate further." David looked up slowly, his eyes calm, unreadable. The faintest flicker of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, because what happened next would not just escalate the situation, it would shatter it. David's calm silence on the plane was never weakness. It was calculation, because when his second call was made, something larger than one man's humiliation began to unfold. The injustice in seat 2B was no longer just personal. It was about to become systemic. On the ground, the viral clip kept multiplying. Commentators dissected every frame, every dismissive glance from the crew, every smug smirk from the passenger who spilled her soda. But soon, other voices started rising. People who had flown Sky Continental before, sharing their own stories. Stories of being denied upgrades, singled out for random searches, spoken to with condescension, while white passengers were treated with discretion and experience. And these weren't just whispers. They were recordings, screenshots, testimonies with receipts. The video of David in first class had opened a floodgate. David knew this wasn't about him alone. That was the brilliance of his strategy. His humiliation had lit a spark. But the fuel was already there. Years of passengers quietly enduring the same prejudice, never believing anyone would listen. Now, with one viral clip, the world was forced to see the pattern. Imagine being in that cabin, watching phones light up around you, realizing this wasn't an isolated insult, but part of a much larger truth. People across the country began connecting the dots. This isn't random. This is how the system works. David's team gathered the evidence swiftly. They weren't just lawyers, they were storytellers. They stitched together testimonies of black business travelers, athletes, families. One by one, a picture emerged of an airline that used uniformed authority to humiliate and exclude. An airline where being in first class didn't shield you from suspicion if your skin was the wrong color. Passengers began speaking on morning shows, voices trembling as they share how they were asked to prove their boarding pass twice, how they were eyed suspiciously in lounges, how attendants assumed they had wandered into the wrong cabin. These weren't accidents. These weren't random. They were the pattern David wanted the world to see. And the more the pattern was exposed, the more impossible it became for the airline to hide behind words like Operation Necessity or Guest Experience. The case against the system was writing itself in real time. On Twitter, in interviews, in every passenger's story that echoed the same theme, dignity denied. David wasn't shouting, wasn't demanding attention. He was patient, letting the voices of ordinary travelers build the wall of evidence. Because he knew the most devastating case is the one you don't have to argue yourself. The truth, once visible, speaks louder than any press release. By the end of the day, it wasn't just about a man in a blue suit humiliated in row 2B. It was about every black traveler who had ever been told, silently or directly, "You don't belong here." But then came the moment no one expected. A leak. An internal memo from the airline's own staff, written months before this flight, quietly warning of disproportionate complaints from minority passengers. Proof they knew. Proof they did nothing. And when that document surfaced, the case was no longer just against the system. It was against their survival. By the time the plane touched the runway, the airline's leadership already knew the truth. This was no longer a PR inconvenience. This was survival. And waiting for them was a voice far colder, far calmer than the chaos they had tried to dismiss. David Miller didn't storm cameras. He didn't rage online. His power was quieter, sharper. Through his legal team, the ultimatum was delivered in clean, surgical language. There would be no negotiations, no endless meetings, no let's review policies lip service. The terms were crystal clear. First, the airline would admit fault publicly, not in vague words like guest experience or unexpected outcome. A real apology, spoken plainly, naming the truth, racial prejudice. Second, every crew member on that flight will be held accountable, not just suspended, fired. The uniform that gave them cover that night would now expose them. Third, structural reform. Hiring and training would change, permanently, from recruitment to leadership. The company would build systems that prevented this kind of random humiliation from happening again. No more hiding behind Operation Necessity when what they meant was bias. And last, transparency. Independent monitors would review how passengers of color were treated. Real accountability, not glossy brochures about experience. The message was simple. Either comply fully, or the deal that once promised to save Sky Continental would instead dismantle it. David had the money, the connections, and the leverage to make sure of it. Imagine the boardroom silence as those demands were read aloud. Suits shifting uncomfortably in leather chairs. Lawyers muttering about liability. PR chiefs scribbling fake smiles into press drafts. And through it all, the sinking realization that this wasn't about one passenger in row 2B. This was about the culture they had built, now collapsing under its own arrogance. For years, they believed discretion meant shielding themselves. That operation necessity meant never having to admit wrong. That power always tilted toward the uniform, never toward the passenger. But now, one man had flipped the script. Let me ask you, if this was you, would you trust an apology without action? Or would you demand the system itself change? Because that's exactly what David did. He didn't just want them sorry. He wanted them transformed. The demands landed like thunder. No wiggle room. No delays. Sign or sink. And just as the executives thought the storm couldn't get any worse, a final clause surfaced, buried in the documents like a dagger. The airline wouldn't just comply. They would compensate, not with vouchers or coupons, but with millions. A financial punishment so heavy it would stain their balance sheet for years. The ultimatum was complete, brutal, final. But would Sky Continental fold his terms or gamble on defiance? The next move was theirs, and the world was watching. In less than 24 hours, the boardroom of Sky Continental no longer felt like a place of power. It felt like a bunker. Executives sat pale and trembling, their polished titles suddenly meaningless under the weight of one man's demands. The same company that had humiliated a black CEO in seat 2B now realized their survival depended on him. The ultimatum had been ruthless, and the evidence overwhelming. The viral clip, the flood of passenger testimonies, the leaked internal memo showing they knew about the disproportionate complaints months earlier. Every card David Miller played was sharper than the last. And with shareholders whispering about lawsuits and investors pulling back, the leadership finally broke. They surrendered. Every demand was signed into binding policy. The public apology would be issued, plain and direct, not corporate spin, not vague wording. Crew members from that flight were terminated immediately, their names quietly erased from the roster. And most humiliating for the airline, the woman who sparked the storm was officially banned from ever flying with them again. The statement was clear. Her entitlement had poisoned the brand beyond repair. But it didn't stop there. Behind the press releases, legal wheels were turning. Jennifer now faced a civil suit for assault. Her deliberate accident with a red soda was caught on camera from 3 angles. The stain on David's suit wasn't just cloth and sugar. It was proof of malicious intent. What she once treated as a triumphant smirk had turned into evidence that would follow her for the rest of her life. The surrender wasn't graceful. It was desperate. Executives signed papers with shaking hands, their eyes darting toward the windows as if the world outside might see their shame. Some muttered about operational necessity, others about protecting the guest experience. But none of it mattered anymore. The company wasn't protecting its image. It was bowing to the very man they tried to humiliate. And David? He didn't gloat. He didn't even smile. He moved like a surgeon completing a procedure, precise, detached, unstoppable. The same silence that once made the cabin uneasy now echoed through corporate halls. But here's the question. Do you really think surrender is the same as justice? Or was this just survival dressed up as reform? Because while Sky Continental had bent the knee, the storm outside their walls was still growing. And by the next sunrise, the entire nation would be demanding answers. The morning after the flight, the world woke up to chaos. What began as one shaky video uploaded from row 2B had turned into the biggest corporate scandal of the year. The clip played on every news broadcast, from cable networks to late-night comedy shows. Commentators dissected every frame. The flight attendant's smirk, the passengers' loud accusations, the soda spilling across that blue suit like a final insult. Sky Continental executives scrambled to contain the fire, but it was too late. The company's official social media accounts were flooded with millions of angry comments. Hashtag demanding justice trended for days. Ordinary travelers shared their own stories of being profiled, dismissed, or degraded by airline staff. What David endured wasn't just a story anymore. It became proof of a larger sickness. Within hours, the airline's board announced emergency actions. Several senior staff were fired before sunrise. The captain of the flight issued a shaky video apology, his eyes darting as though he'd been forced into the confession. But the damage couldn't be undone. Passengers from that flight gave live interviews, describing in painful detail the silence in the cabin, the way the crew's authority crushed one man's dignity. One woman, her voice trembling, admitted, "I didn't speak up because I was afraid of being removed too. I still can't forgive myself." For David, the irony was sharp. The very people who dismissed him as invisible were now center stage, exposed and ashamed before millions. But this was bigger than humiliation. The airline's financial lifeline was collapsing. Shares plunged by double digits overnight. Analysts spoke of existential crisis and irreversible brand damage. It wasn't just a scandal, it was survival at stake. Yet in the swirl of apologies and firings, something else shifted. Reporters began digging into internal complaints of the airline. Ignored cases of discrimination, passengers who had written letters but never received answers, staff who claimed they'd been punished for speaking up. The viral clip cracked the door open, and now the whole rotten system was spilling out. And while David stayed silent, the world buzzed with one question. What would he do next? Was he preparing to speak publicly? Was he already pulling strings behind the scenes? No one knew. But the sense was clear. This was no longer just about one humiliating flight. This was about whether an entire industry could survive under the weight of its own prejudice. The nation held its breath, waiting for David's move. And then, just as the airline thought it had hit rock bottom, a new headline appeared, one that sent their leadership into pure panic. Because what happened next didn't just threaten Sky Continental. It threatened every airline in America. The surrender of Sky Continental should have ended the storm. But instead, it was only the beginning, like a stone dropped in water. The humiliation of one black CO rippled outward, touching places far beyond Seat 2B. By dawn, other airlines were already in panic mode. Executives held late-night video calls, whispering about policy audits and training initiatives. Behind their corporate smiles, fear was spreading. Nobody wanted to be the next viral disgrace. Suddenly, words like discretion and operational necessity didn't sound protective anymore. They sounded dangerous. One wrong move, and their empire could collapse overnight. Social media became the battlefield. Hashtags linked David's name to a movement bigger than one man. Passengers across the world began sharing their own humiliations. Being pulled aside at gates, having upgrades denied, being stared down in lounges where their presence was treated as suspicious. These weren't just stories. They were confessions of how racism hides behind procedure. And people were finally listening. Grassroots groups picked up the fire. Community organizers began holding town halls in airports, staging silent protests in terminals, carrying signs that read, "Our dignity is not random." News outlets ran panels debating whether elite spaces had become invisible cages, where people of color were tolerated only until they challenged the unspoken rules. And here's where the controversy deepened. Some voices pushed back. Commentators claimed the airline was just enforcing its rules. They argued David's treatment was an unfortunate misunderstanding, not racism. But each time someone tried to minimize it, the public snapped back harder. If this was just a mistake, one viral post read, "Why does it always happen to us?" The case against Sky Continental had opened a wound, and now every airline, every lounge, every so-called exclusive space was under the microscope. Suddenly, privilege didn't feel invisible anymore. It felt like it was on trial. Imagine being a CEO of another airline that week, watching your inbox flood with passengers demanding answers. Imagine knowing that one bad clip could erase decades of branding. The fear was real, and so was the change. Within days, airlines rushed out statements, new anti-bias training, third-party reviews, promises of accountability. Whether these moves were sincere or just survival tactics, the message was clear. David's humiliation had rewritten the rules of air travel. But the ripple didn't stop at airlines. Corporate America was watching too. Companies with elite memberships, VIP programs, and private clubs began rethinking how they treated people of color in spaces designed to exclude. David's story became a cautionary tale. Humiliate the wrong man, and you may destroy your own brand. Still, beneath the reforms and apologies, one chilling question lingered. Was this real progress, or just theater to protect profits? Were these companies actually dismantling prejudice, or just repainting the walls while the foundation stayed the same? The movement was gaining strength. Activists were louder. Journalists were digging deeper, and David's silence only made the world more curious. He hadn't spoken publicly since the incident. No interviews, no press conferences, just that single cryptic order on a satellite phone. Execute contingency, full acquisition, now. And then came the moment that turned curiosity into obsession. A leaked image began circulating online. David Miller, stepping into an unmarked jet, his expression unreadable. The caption underneath asked one haunting question. If he already owns the airline, what's his next move? It was months later when the shift could finally be felt. A quiet change in the air, subtle but undeniable. On Sky Continental Flight 501, boarding began like any other day. Rows of first-class seats gleamed under soft lights, the smell of leather and coffee mixing in the cabin. But this time, the story was different. A black family stepped into first class. A father, his wife, and their 2 children, dressed not in power suits, but in the comfort travelers ready for vacation. No one stared with suspicion. No one whispered about whether they belonged. Instead, the flight attendant smiled warmly, bending down to hand the little boy a set of headphones before he even asked. The father adjusted his seat, looking almost surprised at the ease of it all. For viewers, the message was clear. This wasn't random. This was the new normal. The airline had been forced to confront its ugliness, not because it wanted to, but because silence had become more dangerous than truth. After the scandal, changes rolled out faster than anyone thought possible. Training programs were rewritten. Entire crews were replaced. And hidden at the heart of it all was a quiet truth. One man, humiliated in 2B, had flipped an entire system upside down. Think about that for a moment. A single moment of injustice, caught on camera, turned into a movement that reshaped how millions would travel. The humiliation they tried to bury became the spark that redefined what dignity looks like in elite spaces. But here's the question. Was this true reform or just survival wrapped in policy? Were smiles genuine now, or scripted by fear of scandal? For that family in first class, maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was a feeling of ease, the absence of judgment, the dignity of simply existing without suspicion. Still, the memory of that blue suit stained with red soda lingered. That moment in 2B had been more than an accident. It was a mirror. It showed the world what happens when discretion is weaponized, when operational necessity becomes an excuse to erase someone's humanity. And now, every boarding pass scanned, every upgrade granted, every interaction with a flight attendant carried the weight of that history. The irony is chilling. The people who once believed they had the power to decide who belonged in first class ended up teaching the world why belonging can't be decided by arrogance or uniform. And viewers, this is where the story leaves us with choice. Because while this airline changed, the question is, has the world? How many other cabins, boardrooms, and lounges still operate under silence, still believing that prejudice can hide behind procedure? If it happened on this flight, could it happen in your city, your workplace, your child's school? Stories like these aren't just entertainment. They're warnings. They force us to ask, what happens if we stay quiet the next time dignity is online? This is why we tell these stories. Not to relive pain, but to strip the mask off systems that thrive on it. To remind every person watching that power doesn't always look like anger or shouting. Sometimes power is a calm man in seat 2B, holding a boarding pass, holding his silence, holding an entire airline's future in the palm of his hand. And that brings us here to you. If you felt the sting of judgment, if you've ever been told without words that you don't belong, then you already know why these stories matter. Because silence protects injustice. But sharing, witnessing, speaking, that's how change begins. So here's my call to you. Don't just watch and move on. Be part of this. Subscribe, not for me, but because these stories must be heard. Because when one story of humiliation is silenced, 1,000 more go unnoticed. And because the next time it happens, it might not be caught on camera. The cabin door closes. The family settles into their seats, comforted, respected, unseen by prejudice. The plane lifts into the sky, carrying with it the proof that change is possible, but fragile. And so I'll leave you with this. If one man in a blue suit could change an airline, what could we change if we all refuse to stay silent?